So I'll be really focusing on briefly three major issues. One is the rationale, the purpose. All aspect of leadership, as Sinek used to say it, start by why. Why are we doing this? And I think both Rebecca and Professor Bikele said it rightly. I don't want to come back to that. Uh, Climate change is shaping everything that we are doing. It's shaping geopolitics, it's shaping financial architecture, economics, and uh, migration, peace, security, you name them. And of course, Africa is highly vulnerable to climate change, even though we are only contributing less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emission. So it's a major imperative for Africa to see it as really shaping trade, leveraging African continental free trade area, and strengthening this Africa climate economic diplomacy. And of course, recent development has shown that. So we are doing this because we think that you cannot unlock sustainable development, transform the continent without finding the sustainable right solution to the climate issue. The second why we are doing this is that in many areas, Africa approach is fragmented. We have knowledge in one section, we have policymakers in other section, private sector in other section, diplomats negotiating without knowing the overall landscape through which they need to negotiate. And of course, capacity building and even selfish interest of countries that will not be supportive to the continent speaking with one voice. But I'm glad to say that in climate, we are trying to move on speaking with one voice. You have the Nairobi Declaration in 2023, and we also have the Addis Ababa Declaration in 2025. So this is the first one. This is important that we have a societal approach and we have a joint approach in Africa. But as well, as Rebecca explained, and it's aligned with the way that we see it at CELMAD, it's a societal approach. So you need co-creation, the public sector, the private sector, the communities, and the citizen. And we need as well, and this is what CELMAD is promoting, a joint approach of leadership and management, contextualized and innovative. And this is where we are bringing the second aspect of my talk. The second aspect of my talk is related to the courses that we developed with IDEP. And the courses really was to help diplomats have a better and a deeper understanding of African priorities within the climate area and how it intersect and interlinked with their work, including in sustainable development. The second element of our course was really to advance the African common position. As I mentioned earlier, the principle of one voice to ensure a unified approach of Africa to global challenges. And the third element of the course is saying that Africa is not the problem. Africa is a solution. But to say that you need to ground it into rigorous scientific areas where university and other think tanks can come in. And the fourth element is enhancing negotiation strategies and policy influence. And the last point, which is really at the heart of what we are discussing, is how we build network within the African communities, tapping on all the areas in which we have comparative advantages. So the course also, that's my third point. The course was really divided into 6 modules. I want to go deep on that, but you can read the module. I'm sure that Rebecca and Elma would really recall that. The first one was, of course, setting the stage, as I explained, and Professor Bekele and uh, Rebecca explained as well, the imperative of climate within the economic development. The second was reframing African climate narrative, which is what I mentioned earlier as a solution provider. The third was really, we haven't spoken about that, but it's my view, it's a game changer. It is the gender and climate agenda that we brought in critical areas in which Africa should move. And the fourth was related to climate finance and green investment. We discussed it earlier. The art of negotiation and climate, mastering the art of coalition building was the fifth module, and the last one was the one on which I will tap on to conclude and share few thoughts. This is what we call speaking with one voice and navigating the aspect of climate agenda. Listening to both of you, I would just make the following suggestion. Number one, there is a lot of knowledge and initiative going forward, but we don't have a mapping of what's going on, what's working, what is not working. Of course, we have the African Union, all this aspect, we have universities, but it would be good at some point if this gathering could support having a catalog or at least a platform as it was done in Ethiopia on all the knowledge that we are discussing today. For example, Rwanda is a good case. I spent 5 years there, and I'm sure that you understand that it's a good case for Africa as well. The second is how we could have a holistic approach. How in the climate, what university is doing is echoing where we are training our government officials. So the management school, the École nationale d'administration in Francophone countries, think tank, so that we could have a common ground in supporting the climate agenda. So that part is, in my view, important of catalog of knowledge product experiences and of course actors, the mapping of stakeholders that we could tap into. The second I'm seeing, which is important, is in this approach, let's have a holistic approach. How we build human capital, but as well institution, systems, and ecosystem, like the way that Rwanda they are trying to do. When you look at financing, we are receiving less than 5%, and communities less than 2%. So finance should be brought into the conversation. If Africa is in debt distress, how can they support education, they support climate and others? They can't. They are using the money, their fiscal shrinking space, to pay or to repay their debt. So that's why we need this holistic approach of human capital, institution, system, and ecosystem. Third element, and I think Professor Bikili mentioned it, but I would echo it beyond Ethiopia. How can we tap into curricula of all the institutions that are building the capacity of critical stakeholders and make sure that climate is not an add-on, but climate is really grounding this training that we are doing. Because you cannot have a person train without this element and ask him one day, oh, how can you bring in your discussion climate? That's why I mentioned as education should be a strategic infrastructure on our advocacy on climate. It's not really just an add-on. We need to have intellectual tools in this approach, and university and think tanks like ours and think act like institution that we CELMAD we backed ourselves should be brought in. Practice and practice and practice. Third, joint research. um, I think we need to really make sure that we are not consumers of, even if we are part of IPCC or IPBES on biodiversity, but we are also knowledge producers. So that how can we make sure that our joint research is framing the conversation into climate? Joint capacity building. I think I mention it because if you if you have your research that is producing your knowledge product through a rigorous vetting process, how do you use your knowledge product into capacity building? But this will be useless if capacity building is not supporting public policy from design to accountability. And then you benchmark it, and then you have your platform in sharing experience. So public policies and capacity building are interlinked, and we need to know that. Third element, that how we can support existing institutions in Africa, like CAOX and AMSEN, AGN, and other expert groups, to make sure that we have a coherent approach, a cohesive approach, as Rebecca was mentioning, including UNECA Climate Policy Center and other centers within the UN and other areas. National network and alumni fellows. I see that Africa, we are not always, we are fellowship from abroad, but we are not having usually internal continental fellowship. How the university where Professor Bikile is can have fellows in CELMAD, CELMAD having fellows there, so that we have a cross-fertilization and cross-creation of knowledge that we can do. And of course, what we mentioned earlier are the alumni fellows within the CELMAD. And we brought in other tools within CELMAD, the coaching tools, the mentorships, and so on. So I will conclude saying that if we really need to move these procedures, we need to clearly understand what is at stake, who are the stakeholders, what are the comparative advantages of the stakeholders, what is our action plan, how do we measure it, who is taking the lead in each area of the action plan, how do we brought in the African Union, the REX, and of course the countries in all this one, supporting labs where you have private sector, the communities, the civil society, universities, and of course policymakers in one voice discussing the solution. And this is where we have contextualized, so looking at what culture, history, and priorities of Africa, but innovative, looking at the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, and others, including with the private sector, to make sure that towards COP32, Africa will deliver on this agenda and make sure that we support the African agenda in enhancing the climate and looking together boldly and without delay, making sure that we make the unified strategic-led Africa on climate change. And thank you again. And this is where I see the way that we could move forward. And over to you.